December 1945. Southern Germany. The war in Europe is over. Snow settles quietly over the ruins of a defeated Reich. Burned-out buildings stand frozen in silence. Roads, once filled with tanks and artillery, now carry only scattered military convoys and displaced civilians. The sound of gunfire has faded, replaced by something less visible, but far more uncertain. Inside an American command vehicle, George S. Patton studies a map. But this is not a map of Nazi Germany anymore. The front lines are gone. The enemy has surrendered. And yet, Patton's attention is fixed east toward the advancing presence of the Soviet Union. Reports arrive daily, Soviet troops consolidating territory, cities falling under new control, borders shifting, not with explosions, but with decisions. To many, this is peace. To Patton, it looks like the beginning of something else. He had spent years pushing his army forward, never slowing, never hesitating. Now, for the first time, he is being told to stop. But in his mind, the war has not ended. It has only changed direction. And what he begins to say next will place him on a collision course, not with an enemy, but with his own allies. May 1945. The war in Europe ends not with a single moment, but with a collapse. The armed forces of Nazi Germany surrender, lay down their weapons across a shattered continent. Cities from Berlin to Cologne are reduced to rubble. Infrastructure is broken. Governments have disappeared. What remains is a vacuum, political, military, and psychological. Into that vacuum step the victors. From the west, American, British, and French forces establish control over their designated zones. From the east, the Soviet Union advances deeper into Central Europe, its armies occupying vast territories once held by Germany. The meeting point between these forces was not accidental. It had been decided months earlier in conference rooms far from the battlefield. At the Yalta Conference and later at the Potsdam Conference, Allied leaders had agreed on how to divide Germany and manage post-war Europe. These agreements were built on cooperation, but also on compromise. For Joseph Stalin, the war had come at an unimaginable cost. The Soviet Union had lost over 20 million people. Entire regions were destroyed. From his perspective, security was not optional, it was essential. Eastern Europe would serve as a buffer zone, a protective barrier against any future invasion from the West. But what appeared as security to one side began to look like expansion to the other. As Soviet troops occupied countries like Poland, Hungary, and Romania, new governments began to form, governments aligned closely with Moscow. Political opposition was suppressed, influence was consolidated, control was tightened. To many in the West, this did not resemble liberation, it resembled replacement. Still, officially, the alliance held. The war had been won together. Publicly, unity remained intact. But beneath the surface, trust was beginning to erode. Military commanders on the ground started noticing subtle changes. Cooperation became cautious, information was limited, movement was watched more closely. The lines dividing occupied zones began to feel less temporary and more permanent. What had once been a united front against a common enemy was quietly transforming into something else, something uncertain, something fragile. And for some, watching closely within this shifting landscape, the signs were already impossible to ignore. By the summer of 1945, George S. Patton stood at the height of his military career. As commander of the Third Army, he had driven his forces across France with relentless speed after D-Day. His advance had been defined by momentum, rapid breakthroughs, constant pressure, and an instinct for exploiting weakness. In battles like the Battle of the Bulge, his ability to react quickly under pressure had turned the tide at critical moments. To Patton, war was movement. War was aggression. War was something you finished decisively. And now, suddenly, it had stopped. His Third Army was no longer advancing. Instead, it was occupying, administering, waiting. For many commanders, this transition was expected. The war had been won. Stability now mattered more than speed. Reconstruction had begun. But Patton struggled with this new reality. He had spent years viewing the world through the lens of conflict, identifying enemies, predicting threats, acting before hesitation could take hold. And as he observed the shifting political landscape in Europe, he began to form a conclusion that set him apart from many of his peers. He did not see the Soviet Union as a partner in peace. He saw it as the next challenge. Reports coming into his headquarters described Soviet behavior in occupied territories: strict control, political restructuring, limited cooperation with Western forces. These were not battlefield maneuvers, but they carried strategic weight. To Patton, they suggested intent. His perspective was shaped not only by what he observed, but by what he believed. Patton had long held strong anti-communist views. To him, communism represented a system fundamentally opposed to the values he believed the war had been fought to defend. The idea that such a system could expand across Europe under the protection of Allied agreements felt like an unresolved contradiction. At the same time, his relationship with Allied leadership added another layer of complexity. Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, operated with a broader strategic vision. His responsibility was not only military victory, but maintaining unity among the Allies, particularly with the Soviet Union. Stability, diplomacy, and adherence to agreements were essential to preventing further conflict. But Patton thought in terms of momentum and opportunity. Where Eisenhower saw the need to preserve peace, Patton saw the risk of delaying an inevitable confrontation. He believed that the Western Allies, having just defeated Nazi Germany, were in a position of strength, militarily experienced, strategically positioned, and logistically capable. In his view, if conflict with the Soviet Union was going to happen, it would be better fought now, rather than later when conditions might be less favorable. These were not official policies, they were personal convictions, and increasingly they were being expressed openly. In meetings, in conversations, and in remarks that began to circulate beyond his immediate circle, his views became harder to contain. What he saw as strategic clarity, others began to see as dangerous. Because the war may have ended, but the balance between peace and another conflict was becoming more fragile with every passing day. Late 1945. The war is over, but inside Allied command, tension is quietly building. At the center of it stands George S. Patton. By now, his views are no longer private observations. They are becoming statements, direct, unfiltered, and increasingly difficult to ignore. In occupied Germany, Patton begins speaking openly about the Soviet Union, not as an ally, but as a future adversary. He questions Allied decisions. He criticizes the post-war arrangements, and most controversially, he suggests that the war may have ended too soon. To Patton, the logic is simple. The Western Allies had just defeated one of the most powerful military forces in history. Their armies were battle-hardened, coordinated, and positioned across Europe. The Soviet Union, though vast and formidable, had also suffered enormous losses. In his view, this was a moment of advantage, a moment that would not last. Statements attributed to Patton during this period reflect his growing frustration.
He reportedly argued that the United States and Britain had defeated the wrong enemy and that the Soviet Union posed a greater long-term threat to Europe. These were not official declarations, but in the fragile environment of post-war diplomacy, even informal remarks carried weight. Within Allied leadership, concern begins to grow. Figures like Dwight Eisenhower understood the stakes. The alliance with the Soviet Union, though strained, was still essential. Millions of troops remained stationed across Europe. Any breakdown in cooperation could escalate rapidly. At the political level, under Harry Truman, the United States was transitioning from wartime urgency to post-war stability. The priority was reconstruction, not renewed conflict. Patton's words cut against that priority. They introduced a possibility that leaders were trying to avoid, even thinking about.
Because the reality was clear. Another war, so soon after the last, would not be limited. It would be larger, more destructive, and far less controllable. Still, Patton continued. To him, silence was more dangerous than honesty. But with every remark, the distance between his position and that of his superiors began to widen. And that widening gap was about to reach a point where it could no longer be managed quietly. Autumn 1945. The tension surrounding George S. Patton is no longer subtle. What had once been private frustration is now visible at the highest levels of command. Reports circulate. Conversations are repeated. His remarks about the Soviet Union, about the outcome of the war, about what should have come next, are no longer contained within closed rooms. They reach Washington. They reach Allied leadership, and they begin to carry consequences. At this stage, the war's political balance is delicate. Europe is in ruins. Millions are displaced. The cooperation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, however strained, remains essential to maintaining order across occupied territories. Any suggestion of renewed conflict is not just controversial, it is dangerous. Within this environment, Patton's position becomes increasingly untenable. His role requires discipline, restraint, and alignment with official policy. Instead, his words suggest an alternative path, one that challenges the decisions already made by Allied governments. For leaders like Dwight D. Eisenhower, this creates a critical problem. Eisenhower is not only managing armies, he is managing an alliance. Every action, every statement carries diplomatic weight. Trust between nations is fragile, and even the perception of hostility could destabilize the entire post-war arrangement. Patton's remarks risk sending the wrong signal, not just internally, but to the Soviet Union itself. If interpreted as official intent, they could provoke suspicion, escalation, even confrontation. And so, a decision begins to form. It is not immediate, it is not dramatic, but it is deliberate. Patton will be removed from positions where his influence carries strategic risk. In October 1945, he is reassigned from command of the Third Army to a lesser role, governor of Bavaria, and later commander of the 15th Army, a unit largely focused on historical documentation rather than combat readiness. It is a clear shift. Not a punishment in name, but a reduction in authority, a distancing. His voice, once central to Allied operations, is now being moved to the margins. Officially, the reasons include a pattern of controversial behavior, earlier incidents, public comments, administrative challenges. But beneath those reasons lies a deeper reality. Patton's vision no longer aligns with the direction chosen by Allied leadership. The war he believed might continue is one they are determined to prevent. And so, without confrontation, without a public break, his role is quietly diminished.
The momentum that had defined his career comes to a halt, not on the battlefield, but within the structure of command itself. Yet even as his influence fades, the questions he raised do not disappear. They remain, unresolved, beneath the surface of a fragile peace. Because the tension he identified is already beginning to shape the world that comes next. By late 1945, the role of George S. Patton had been quietly reduced. No public confrontation, no dramatic dismissal, just distance. His reassignment removed him from the center of military decision-making at a moment when the future of Europe was being shaped. The Third Army, the force he had driven across continents, was no longer his to command. In its place came administrative duties and historical oversight, far removed from the urgency of the battlefield. For the Allies, stability took priority. Under Harry T. Truman and coordinated through leaders like Dwight D. Eisenhower, the objective was clear: avoid another war at all costs. Europe needed rebuilding. Armies needed to stand down. Civil order had to be restored before anything else. But beyond official policy, something deeper was unfolding. The alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany was beginning to fracture. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence tightened. Governments aligned with Moscow solidified control. In the West, concern grew, quietly at first, then more openly. The division of Germany hardened. Cooperation became cautious. Suspicion replaced trust. Within this emerging reality, Patton's earlier warnings would take on a different light. Not as policy, not as accepted strategy, but as a perspective that, in some ways, had anticipated the direction events would take. Still, timing mattered. And in 1945, the world was not ready for another war. It was exhausted. And so, the path chosen was not confrontation, but containment. A fragile peace built not on trust, but on restraint. One that would shape global history for decades to come. In the final months of 1945, the world stood in a rare moment of silence. Not peace in its purest form, but a pause. The guns had stopped, the armies had halted, and across Europe, people began the slow process of rebuilding lives that war had nearly erased. Within that silence, voices like George S. Patton sounded out of place. He did not speak of reconstruction. He spoke of unfinished conflict. To many, his views felt dangerous, too aggressive for a world that had already given everything it could to war. The idea of continuing the fight, of turning against a recent ally, was not just controversial, it was unthinkable. And yet, history would move in a direction that echoed some of those early concerns. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union would not last. Distrust would deepen. Europe would divide. A new kind of conflict would emerge. One fought not with immediate invasion, but with influence, pressure, and the constant presence of military power. The Cold War would define the second half of the 20th century. Looking back, Patton's perspective sits in a complicated place, not entirely right, not entirely wrong, but rooted in a reality that was still forming. He saw momentum where others saw exhaustion. He saw threat where others hoped for stability. And in doing so, he stood slightly ahead of the moment, aligned with a future that had not yet fully revealed itself. But history is not shaped by foresight alone. It is shaped by timing. And in 1945, the world chose to step back from the edge, not because the danger had disappeared, but because humanity needed, even briefly, to believe that the worst was over.